Hello. Hi all, thank you for joining. We'll be getting started shortly.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 5th session of the Housing as a Pathway to Justice training series. This training series is being launched in collaboration with the Corporation for Supportive Housing and Enterprise to provide tools and best practices for landlords and housing providers on how to better serve and house people formerly incarcerated. Today's session will focus on strategies promoting transparent communication with local businesses and community stakeholders to overcome NIMBYism. And to dive into this topic, we'll have a presentation with Lauren. We can move to the next slide. So we'll start with a presentation with Lauren Bellis to provide some grounding about what NIMBYism is. And then we'll hear from a panel of experts in this space. And then we'll close out with some discussions and activities. So before I pass it off to Lauren, I just want to mention that we are recording this presentation and we will be sharing the recording as well as some resources after the event. And with that, I'll pass it off to you, Lauren.
Okay. Hi. Okay, I wanted to make sure I'm unmuted, which I am, and now I'm spotlighted. All right, hi everybody. I am Lauren Velez. I'm the Associate Director for New York at the Corporation for Supportive Housing on our Metro team. You can go to the next slide, please. Like Camila said, we're going to talk a little bit about what NIMBYism is and kind of the history of NIMBYism to get us grounded for the rest of the conversation today. A brief word on what we do at CSH for anybody who might not be familiar. CSH is a national nonprofit, and we refer to ourselves as an intermediary for supportive housing, meaning that we don't actually own or operate our own, units of supportive housing, but we work with communities all over the country to devise, implement, revise supportive housing solutions to address homelessness in their communities. So we do this through 4 main lines of business. We have a really robust training center where we offer a lot of training and education opportunities through live webinars, self-paced, things like that. Policy reform, so policy and advocacy work on a local, state, and federal level, consulting and assistance, and then lending. So we're also CDFI and have lending products to help get supportive housing developments off the ground. A quick plug for supportive housing. It really is an effective intervention and solution towards homelessness by combining affordable housing with services that help people, most often whom have the most complex challenges in our communities. And it's really aimed at helping them live with stability, autonomy, and dignity. So on the screen are some, services that might be offered within supportive housing to help folks be able to maintain stability and increase self-sufficiency and all those wonderful things. So it's certainly not an exhaustive list, but kind of a snapshot. Go ahead. All right, so what is NIMBYism? What are we talking about here today? You can go to the next slide and we'll find out. Thanks. So NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, generally refers to somebody, often homeowners or homeowners associations, who object to the siting of something that they perceive as hazardous or unpleasant in the area where they live. And a special caveat here is that, they're very focused on not having this in their backyard, but they're not necessarily raising those similar, concerns or objections for similar developments elsewhere. So the term NIMBYism really emerged in the 1970s and was used to describe a community effort where folks came together collectively to push back against efforts by electrical utility companies to construct nuclear power generators in residential areas. So it was effective and it grew through grassroots movements focused on environmental safety, mostly in the beginning, to include people in communities who were opposed to things like landfills and industrial waste plants, again, in their communities. And this was typically an effort that was employed by middle and high income majority white communities. And this generality really led to an assumption that opponents of these different things didn't care if the developments took place in lower income and minority communities, as long as it was not in their backyard. So by the 1990s, environmentalists and social justice advocates had generally adopted a negative usage of the phrase, using it to describe opponents of developments that would benefit poor and marginalized communities. Today, often when you're talking about NIMBYism, it usually refers to opponents of development companies' projects, often opposing the location of affordable and supportive housing for folks with developmental disabilities, behavioral health challenges, and other marginalized groups like folks with histories of incarceration. So NIMBYism is often driven more or less openly by racism and classism. However, that's not, what people are bringing to the table as their concerns. The concerns are often commonly voiced as, being about increased crime rates, concerns about traffic congestion, strain on sewage systems, overcrowded schools, lower property values, and, a decrease in their quality of life. However, when these developments are built and they do come to pass, the fears typically don't. We aren't seeing those things. We're not seeing increased crime rates, traffic congestion, strain on those sewer lines, and overcrowding or strain put on the school systems. So those fears are not really based in evidence that shows that this is what comes with these developments. And it can seem that these opponents prefer, or at least mind a whole lot less, that these projects and their potential implications be placed in poorer minority, majority neighborhoods, which has really furthered NIMBYism being seen as a facet of racism and class-based discrimination. So some examples of NIMBYism that feel relevant to the conversation today are things like opposing a development for formerly homeless seniors. So some of the concerns that might be voiced in opposition here are fears that neighborhood crime will increase, or a worry that businesses will suffer due to panhandling and people, being outside begging for money, things like that. Or opposing an affordable high rise. And again, not saying, we don't want low-income folks coming into this neighborhood, but more hearing concerns about, this will be an eyesore. It might block my view of a historic downtown building, or worries that it will lower property value, or opposing a substance use treatment center, with that will hear things like, I don't want drug users coming into my community, or focusing the concern on the potential risk that this could pose to like children in the community or something like that. And again, these concerns often are not based in reality or evidence that we have of these things coming to pass with these developments. You can go ahead. So you're going to hear a whole lot more from our fantastic panelists about NIMBYism, how it has come to pass with real life developments and efforts, and their techniques for combating NIMBYism. But to give kind of a like overview or snapshot, 4 ways that we can help combat NIMBYism are by engaging neighbors. So getting to know your neighbors, finding out what's important to the community, especially if you're not part of that community and you're coming in and looking to develop, get to know, what's important to the community, what they care about. Hear out their concerns. So host listening sessions to talk to neighbors and let them, be heard. I think that being heard can often go a really long way, and also provides an opportunity, for communication and education about your development and what you're doing, and engaging folks in those collaborative discussions. So you have an opportunity to dispel myths and talk more about why the development would actually benefit the community. Problem solving. Think about how you can work with the community to allay their concerns. So those concerns that might be raised in listening sessions, really thinking about what is the root of their concern, what are they really worried about, and how can we allay some of these fears. Also showcasing, past work as examples of success to show the benefit of these developments. And then education, really helping the community understand what you do, who you serve, and why, and helping them understand how housing actually makes communities safer and is a huge benefit. So that is my spiel, and we're gonna move into the more meat of the discussion with our panelists. Any questions or thoughts or comments though, before we, on just like the history of NIMBYism? Any clarification needed? Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Lauren. And with that, we'll go ahead and start with our panelist discussion. So we're joined by Wendell Walters. He works as the manager for advocacy and policy at the Osborne Center for Justice Across Generations, where he advances advocacy for reentry housing, parole reform, and support for the incarcerated aging community. Before joining Osborne, he served as a legislative assistant with the U.S. Congressman and also with a commissioner at the New York City's Department of Housing and Preservation Development. Joining Wendell, we'll have Jesse Butuz. He works as the Regional Vice President for Development at the Community Builders, Inc., also known as TCB. And at TCB, he manages real estate development activities in New York and New Jersey, and has been with the organization since 2007. Before, over the course of his career at TCB, he has led neighborhood scale revitalization efforts that have included like the Ridgeway development, Yonkers, Beach 21 Street development of Far Rockaway. And lastly, we'll be joined by Katie Devine. She brings a wide range of underwriting, project management, and nonprofit administration expertise. She's the principal of Rockabill, and her work in affordable and supportive housing and shelter development has resulted in a number of successful projects, over 3,500 units of preservation in new construction, multifamily, supportive, and transitional housing projects. And before moving to New York in 2018, Katie did work for several years in a Chicago-based developer firm called Evergreen Real Estate Group. And most recently in New York, she also worked as a director of housing development at the Southside United HDFC. So with that, I'll open it up for the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Lauren.
Thanks, Camila. Okay, so we can dig right in. And Jesse, I think that we will start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about a specific project that you have worked on where NIMBYism presented itself and how you responded to these challenges that came up?
Sure, and thanks again for the opportunity to speak with the panel. One of our biggest challenges is virtually every project we work on ends up with some form of NIMBYism, and it could be, from folks saying we don't want, in our high income area, those kinds of people in whatever veiled way you want to hear it, to even folks in communities that may be more impoverished that don't necessarily want to see people from the outside coming in and changing the community dynamic. One place that we've been really active on this and where we've been really proactive with trying to respond to neighborhood concerns is in Far Rockaway. So we're working on a development right now called Ocean Crest. It's located in a great location, just less than a mile from downtown Far Rockaway. The thing about this neighborhood is that it's underwent a tremendous amount of new investment. So there was a massive rezoning. There have been other new rezonings going on around the peninsula. One of the last few areas with a lot of buildable land in New York City to address the housing crisis. I think the flip side to that has been Rockaway feels dumped on with new developments, new housing, and a whole bunch of new change for a place that hasn't experienced this kind of change really since the 70s. So as a result, we had actually entered into a purchase agreement to get this property and go through ULURP and rezone it in March of 2020. So folks, I don't need to draw a map as to what happened then. ULURP shuts down, COVID hits. And in the process, all this new construction continues. And all of these neighbors are feeling really inconvenienced by these massive new developments that are going in place, all these new roadways, things like that being developed, to the point that the community board recommended a total moratorium on new development. So this development we're proposing is a 105 unit development. We are co-locating a daycare center there. Originally, we had proposed it as a 120 unit development, but through the course of conversation with the community, and we'll talk about some of those strategies as we move on here, we've had to really make adjustments. And I think one of the lessons and one of the takeaways that we'll talk about is you really can't work neighborhood connections and trying to advocate for your organization and for what you're trying to do too much. And that goes for political stakeholders, neighborhood groups. We spent a tremendous amount of time and energy meeting and re-meeting with every civic association and local neighborhood group to hear out their concerns. This area is flood prone, is an area that took a massive amount of damage, obviously from Hurricane Sandy, but also from routine events. That flood that happened a couple of weeks ago, a great example. So, what we've tried to do is highlight sustainability benefits in this neighborhood in particular, why this is part of the solution. Infrastructure upgrades we can make to try to help homeowners that live nearby mitigate their flood situations. Obviously, affordability always comes up. And I think, that was never clearer than in a community board meeting I was in where somebody point blank asked, how would we make sure that this building was not full of minorities? So those kind of things come up and it's pretty eyebrow raising and it's a little difficult to keep your cool, frankly, when you're kind of things like that straight ahead. But what we have tried to do is co-opt folks that are clearly open to this sorts of thing, but want to see adjustments and changes. And so one of the strategies we often use is, if it does need to be a little smaller, how do we adjust that size without making the project economically infeasible? I think one thing that we do try to avoid is making concessions when it comes to certain special populations and certain population densities. So that means if we have a supportive development or we have a 25% supportive development, we take that head on and we try to, be pretty upfront about what we're doing and why it's important and that we're serving folks that live in your community. Neighborhood preference is always a major issue that comes up in these sorts of discussions. And what we've really been helped with was a really successful development in downtown Far Rockaway that has nailed every one of these neighborhood concerns. And so because we had experience with the community and they knew who we were and they've seen us before and they've seen a great project, we've had some great experiences when it comes to, I'll put it this way, community board hears a lot of new development pitches from a lot of different developers. They've treated us a lot more fairly and evenly than they have with others. So I'll leave it at that. So that's really the broad strategy we've taken here in Rockaway. And the goal here is just continue to communicate, continue to deal with the outreach, and don't shy away from the tough questions, but try to really hear what the community is asking for.
Mhm. Thanks, Jesse. You brought up a lot of points that I want to kind of elevate and re-emphasize. One of, not in any particular order, but the infrastructure benefits to the community. I think that that's a really incredible point that not a lot of people would, think of or consider when they are thinking about, new developments happening in their neighborhoods. So there are a lot of ways that you can really creatively discuss the benefits to try and engage the community around those. So I appreciate you mentioning that. You also talked about, the neighborhood or community kind of knowing you and having that reputation as being a benefit in the community, which I think is really important as well. And I mentioned earlier, using your past successes as a way to positively engage the community as well. And I think once you do have an established reputation, it is much easier to kind of get folks on board, and you can galvanize support from folks that you've kind of gone through this process with already. And then you mentioned that there was some pretty blatant racism that was brought up in a community meeting, or I'm assuming it was like a listening session or feedback session around not wanting, minorities, or we'll hear like those people, coming into the community. Can you say a little bit about how you kind of like in that moment respond to what are pretty blatantly racist or hateful comments? I mean.
So, in that one, I literally said, I'm not going to dignify that comment with a response, and I moved on. I think that there are situations where we're confronted by this more blatantly and more upfront, and in some ways where it's, clearly bubbling beneath the surface.
Yeah.
I don't want to kind of dip around different projects, but we had one development we were working on in upstate New York, and, they came with a disinformation letter that they had handed out to everybody in the neighborhood, and the room was full. And that disinformation letter was, alternately referred to the development as public housing, affordable housing, greedy developers taking money from you, moving in all of these kinds of people into your school district. Wow. And we were confronted by it by a room of, standing room only, very angry room of people as we proposed our pretty modest 30-unit development. And so in those cases, it's difficult to parry every response. You just try to find the middle ground in terms of being direct on what the benefits are for the community. And, again, as you hear this feedback, take what's reasonable, try to integrate it into our plan, and then move forward.
Yeah. Thanks, Jesse. Okay. Wendell, I want to talk to you for a minute now. What are some of the preventative measures that a project team can put in place when they are starting a project? Which are kind of like the most efficient tools that you can employ? Oh, you're muted.
My dog back here, just in case he gets crazy. Well, a lot of the things that Jesse just described, I mean, community builders, they know what they're doing in terms of working with the community when you're bringing, projects that, are supportive in nature, and they target a particular community. So, and I wrote down in my notes here, as relates to this question, get in there early, as early as possible. Just to set the groundwork, just to elicit some of the even crazy comments, but also some of the legitimate comments as well. I just want to take a quick minute to describe who Osborne Association is. We're not a classic developer like Community Builders or Rockville. We are primarily a criminal justice service organization. We've been around for 80 plus years. We're throughout the state. We just opened the office up in Buffalo, headquarters in the Bronx. We work with the criminal justice system from arrest to reentry. But we've come over the years to realize how important the housing situation is. The number one issue for reentry is housing and the ability to find a place to stay upon the release from jail or prison. So we've dipped our toe into it a bit, not just as a service provider, because we do that with bigger affordable housing projects that we've been able to partner with some developers for an allocation of units for the previously incarcerated. But a couple of years ago, we were given a previously work release building in the Bronx to us by the state that we're now in the middle of hopefully concluding construction soon, repurposing into a transitional housing facility for those who are coming home from prison, 135 beds. You know, we're not the developers that we have here on the call, so we rely on a lot of other different mechanisms for assistance. And we're not charging anybody, of course, to stay. I don't think we even have, the public benefits coming into our project, with the exception of, from the clients, with the exception of the help from DHS in the city for operating assistance each year, which is critical to being able to finance, certainly a large part of the project. It's in the Bronx. It's in the Marcenia section of the Bronx, and we started early. We got in there. We had a charrette, and aside from, we knew there was going to be beds there, but just what else could be accommodated in the community. I was actually part of that outreach to the community. I'm previously incarcerated myself, so I know the issues that confront this group of people. And yes, going through the community board, going through electeds, clearly going through hiring, PR firms and community liaisons. Those are all great. Those are all things that, depending on which project it is and where you're located, those things can help you getting out in front, starting early. But the most important, I think, and most efficient way to get community buy-in, particularly for this community, which is subject to enormous fear mongering and this, all over the place, in all different kind of issues that are not related to even housing, of course, is the sincerity and the commitment to the community and to this project, and the need from a policy point of view to address this issue, because thousands and thousands of people are coming back to New York State, typically New York City, from incarceration each year. And many of them have been away for a long, long time, and they need intense case management, intense counseling. And that's kind of what we do. Obviously, we'll be doing that with the Fulton Reentry Community Center, but we also, as I said, partner with other affordable housing developers for an allotment of units within their larger project for this community, and we reach out to the state through ESHI for operating assistance in that manner. But I go back to my biggest point really is the sincerity and the commitment to the community that is not just at the beginning. It has to be a constant, maintained effort to work with the community at all levels, because things change over years. I mean, you go there's this, you're talking about going to ULERP, and this moratoriums happen, and things change, people change, positions change.
Administrations.
Right. Administrations change. So you got to really continue to maintain that effort and doing the outreach. And it does ultimately pay off. And even still, there's going to be some issues that pop up, but those are in our experience, that is the most efficient way, and they ultimately pay off.
Thanks. As I am listening to all the efforts that you're describing and thinking about some of the things you've described for us as well, Jesse, I'm struck by how it's a really huge effort on the part of the developers who want to bring these developments into the communities to dispel myths and fact check and engage the community and hire, you mentioned like hiring PR consultants and things like that. Those are all huge efforts in response to what is often like a lot of disinformation and fear mongering that is not based in, rooted in transparency or factual things. So it's striking to me, I guess, the impact that, sometimes a small group of opponents or, NIMBYs can have, and the ripple effect that it creates, and then the huge amount of work and effort that goes into pushing back against that So we also see these challenges when we're talking about developing safe havens and shelters. Katie, can you talk about some of the challenges that you've encountered and how you've addressed them with regard to those particular things, thinking about safe havens and shelters and communities?
Yes, just wanted to make sure I wasn't muted. Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me join today. It's really quite a pleasure to be here, and also to hear about the good work being done at TCB and Osborne, although of course it's a small world, so I knew they were doing good work anyway. At Rockaville, we're a consulting and development company. We've been around for about 18 years. We're started primarily to help nonprofit owners and developers of affordable housing to accomplish their affordable housing transactions, really to fill a capacity gap in terms of finance and project management. Over the years, we've grown into being, in addition to joint venture developer of affordable housing, we also have a construction arm to the company. And in the past few years, I in particular have been focusing on shelter and safe haven development in New York City, as well as supportive housing, which means SRO preservation in New York City. And I've had plenty of experience with NIMBYism from the nice suburbs of Chicago and Indianapolis to upstate New York to New York City. I've had very different types of outcomes based on different projects, and I don't know that it's necessarily about the project. Sometimes I feel like it's luck. All the stars have to align in order to have everything be tied up neatly with a bow. In terms of safe havens and shelters, I have a project that closed recently. It was a very difficult transaction. I'm working on it with a nonprofit developer. I'm a consultant on that deal. This is a safe haven with a co-located federally qualified health center, an Article 28 health clinic that serves specifically homeless people and supportive housing residents. And that will be on the first floor, and then above is a safe haven, and it's a hotel conversion, and it's in Chinatown in New York City. And, I'll just start by saying 2.5 years ago, there were 3 shelters being planned for Chinatown. And 2 of them were abandoned by DHS along the way, and one of them closed on December 29th and started construction. It was really tough. The community pushed back quite a lot. It was different specific community groups pushing back about the types of services that were going to be provided, saying that there was no homelessness in their community, saying that there was no need for these health services that are going to be offered in their community. And it took a lot of education. Fortunately, about half of the community board was on board from the beginning, and the other half required quite a bit of hand-holding and education. And I think the biggest thing was, trying to shape hearts and minds a bit about the fact that, during the pandemic, the Asian community in New York City had a lot of really terrible things happen, right? Yeah. And there was a fear that the homeless people who came into the community would continue to do terrible things to the Asian population. Explaining to the community and having, obviously people of the community explaining that there is quite a lot of invisible homelessness in the Asian community in Chinatown, that homeless does not just mean street homeless, explaining that supportive services and, medical clinic, things like that are useful to everyone helped.
Mhm.
I will
Mhm.
say though, that in the case of that project, sometimes you're not going to win the hearts and minds. And sometimes the city, or it's really usually the city in New York, needs to make a decision about whether they're going to give in. And the city didn't give in. And so, you know, we have a project under construction and we'll open in a year and we'll see how it goes. And it probably will not be easy. I mean, you know, there were protests, there were signs, there were banners across, you know, East Broadway and in Chinatown. And, you know, it probably will not be smooth, but
Mhm.
I'm really grateful that I have a nonprofit client on this project that specifically, you know, they believe in the work they do and they know that they're providing services that are necessary in their community. And
Mhm.
so while sometimes you can lay all the right groundwork and everything works out positively for your deal and you open and you're welcomed with open arms, sometimes it's going to be messy until a couple years down the road, right? And shelter providers, I know Osborne has this experience, TCB I'm sure has this experience too, that a couple years down the road, once you have a community advisory board set up, once the people in the community are recognizing that their voice is heard, once they recognize that no, it isn't a blight on the community, that this is actually helping to serve a problem that's been there from the beginning, right? You know, I think that that's also a positive outcome. It's not quite as much of a feel good because you sort of have to fly under the radar and be careful for longer than you would like. You know, I just want to address quickly though one thing. Jesse, you mentioned that, you know, someone mentioned in a community meeting, you know, it was with overtly racist. And, you know, I had that experience recently too, although it was someone saying, our addict's going to move in next door to me, right? And you know, I kind of and she kept repeating the word addict, and you know, I didn't say anything specific to address it. You know, what I said was, you know, people with substance use disorder live in every apartment building in New York City.
Yes.
But you know, I do wish that that I had said that, you know, I wouldn't dignify that, or at least I wish that I had said, you know, that that's an insulting name to call someone who has, you know, substance use disorder. But in any case, I guess my response was okay. Yeah, that's what I got.
Thanks, Katie. You mentioned a
Can
couple
I jump? I'm sorry.
Oh yeah. Oh my God. Yes, absolutely. Please.
Just a quick comment, because this is, you know, from what Jesse heard and what Kay just described.
Yeah.
You cannot escape the racial undertones of these kind of comments in this discussion. I mean, it's just plain as day, right? Substance use, you know, low income, you know, affordability, all these things, in my opinion, are just masquerading for perceived notions of Black and brown people coming into a neighborhood and doing negative things, as if this community of people don't want to improve themselves, don't want to go to a substance use facility to get help, to find a place to stay that's going to provide this kind of services and wrap around services for the community and for their people. It's like, it's just and for the previously incarcerated, you know, just, it's like triple down kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing that we fight all the time. That's why the credible messenger issue is important, because, you know, folks like Osborne and the Fortune Society and other groups on the city, this is what we do to help these individuals reintegrate back into society in a sustained manner that's going to ultimately provide public safety to the city of New York and to the state of New York. Supportive housing, affordable housing, particularly for the previously incarcerated, is a public safety issue. Housing-based stability, and these racial undertones are just like so I mean, you got to be careful how we frame it, certainly, but it's really blatant and things that we have to constantly overcome.
Yeah.
Have to be
Yeah.
said. Sorry.
No, I appreciate that. And I agree with you. And that's why, like in the grounding at the top of the call, I think that it's important to call out that a lot of this is rooted in racism and masked as concerns about things like, increased crime, or supposing that folks are going to come in and they will be addicts and that they will be, all of these things that they would deem, undesirable, and using terms that are certainly not trauma informed to describe them. And the work doesn't finish then, right, when you get the okay to move forward with a development, because then you've got when the shelter is built or the housing is built, you also have to think about the impact that it's going to have on the people that you're moving in if they're coming into a community that clearly doesn't want them there and has no problem voicing that. And think through, how you're going to support folks and continue to engage the community even after the development is green lighted. And so, Wendell, I think you had mentioned earlier the need for continued transparency and engagement and communication, because it doesn't kind of stop once you just get like the go ahead for building.
That's right. That's right. We got a project in Brooklyn where we're part of a larger affordable housing development, and we're there. Building looks nice. People are great. Who are there. The picture of the folk dealing with the keys in this slide. I mean, that's just priceless. To see the look in the face when they have this opportunity to step into their own place. But we're constantly dealing with community issues, even from the police department, even from the police department, who feel that, oh, you're great, a new program that's bringing this community into this community.
More work for us.
So it's like, it never really.
Yeah, and then it almost can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because then they're under a microscope and you're almost looking for things to
Something's going to happen. Something's going to happen. The odds are, just probabilities that something may happen. It's usually from somebody from the outside coming into the area. But I'll shut up now. But it gets me kind of going.
No, I appreciate all of the comments, and the conversation can be fluid. I think there's a lot to cover and a lot of different facets and aspects of NIMBYism that impact, developments from every single stage. I neglected to mention at the top of the call when I was introducing myself that previous to coming on board at CSH for the past decade, I worked in the Midwest doing supportive housing program and development, and it's all over the country. So also, in the Midwest, experience a lot of pushback in NIMBYism with new developments, a lot of kind of considerations of communities of like, all right, well, who's going to come into this building then? So, I'm in this zip code and I don't see homelessness. Like you said, Katie, kind of like that invisibility of the homelessness. Like, we don't need these services. So why would I support something that's going to bring other folks in, from different communities into my community? And it can be challenging to combat that, but then there's also education opportunities, I think, to say, highlight like what you were getting at, Katie, that there are issues in the community. And if you can get community members that are willing to come and speak to the things that they do see and that are present in the community, it's, you can kind of expand their knowledge and information. Whether or not that changes hearts and minds, like you said, depends on the community and who you get in the room and who you're talking to. But yeah, that engagement is incredibly important. As well as education around terms that we should or should not be using, like addicts and, convicts and criminals and things like that. So moving along to talk about some of the concerns and costs of addressing these challenges as compared to, not addressing them. We can think of costs in a lot of different ways. There's, of course, the financial, like actual costs, right? The opportunity costs or lost opportunity costs, and then social costs as well. But Katie, if we could start with you to talk a bit about the financial costs of addressing or not addressing the challenges that come up as it relates to NIMBYism.
Yeah, sure. I think when we had our prep call for this, the the first thing that I said was, but what are the costs is, if you don't do it, no matter how much it costs, if you don't do it, there's a strong likelihood your project's not going to happen. So it doesn't, the cost is definitely worthwhile. There are incremental costs, what are you to having more community meetings, printing more poster boards with renderings, hiring more consultants and things like that. But all of those are really sort of get lost in the wash as a part of the development cost. I don't know of any projects, and I'm certain that someone on this call does, but I can't think of any projects that have been successfully constructed where they said, we spent too much money trying to engage the community and getting the community on board with our development, right? I think that it costs a lot of money to do the affordable housing projects. Supportive housing projects cost a lot of money. There's the acquisition costs, there's the pre-development costs, you're paying an architect, you're paying a lawyer, you're paying for all kinds of things. And if you get far down the road and you haven't done the work that you need to do, sometimes there are planning processes in municipalities that can take upwards of 2-3 years. I mean, Jesse, you said 3 years, you're going to have the ULURP will be certified next week. So, but I imagine that TCB has spent a lot of money, as have investors and funders, and not having done that work could put all of that money at risk, which is one reason why, and I'm actually grateful for this, that a lot of the financing tools that we use require some evidence, not necessarily of community support, but that community outreach is being undertaken, right? And, at a very basic level, small pre-development loans require some kind of evidence that you've presented to someone in the community about what you're up to, and I think that that's really important.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie. Jesse, can you talk to us about the opportunity costs?
Sure. So, I mentioned, our organizational model, and I kind of glossed over who we are. Community Builders is a large nonprofit. We're active in 15 states and Washington, D.C. But what we try to do is take a national footprint and make it local. So where we have regional offices like here in New York, the neighborhoods we engage in, we really want to go deeper in. So one of the ways that we do that, the tools we use to do that, is by sometimes engaging local partners. We've had developments where we may have a local nonprofit who, even though we're a nonprofit, we have an additional nonprofit that's really neighborhood based to do the introduction, the walk around. And then there may even be, some developer fee sharing there if they become a real partner in the deal. Mm-hmm. Strictly because what it does is creates opportunities for us to go deeper where we are. So as folks can know us as more of a local, entity, and no longer that, Boston-based organization that's coming in from out of town to, pick our bones and make community. They look at us more as a local partner. One thing we've done in terms of trying to look at these opportunity costs is, where we've engaged that local partnership, we look at what are the gains we can get to that local partner beyond just dollars and cents. So is that, commitment to job training? Is that commitment to utilization of local businesses? Is that leading up front with those local businesses we intend to use, right? Like key critical partners in the construction and the development of the project. Trying to make it clear that the efforts that we're taking, the money that we're bringing in is going into this community and staying in this community. Super crucial. And it's been, I would say, again, very successful in Far Rockaway, in so much as now they know us, they know the partners that we're working with. But one strategy we're looking at now is another development that was recently approved here in Rockaway. It's a multi-phase development, huge deal. Each phase is putting in money into a fund, a portion of the developer fee to a fund that's going to be administered by a local nonprofit coalition. And they're going to do micro-targeted grants for these nonprofit groups, 5,000, 10,000. That makes a big difference when you're a small organization. Awesome. And so, that's something we're very, open to. And we said, look, I mean, it's not about dollars and cents when you're a mission-based nonprofit. It's more about what are we doing to make sure that we're maximizing our impact. So those are the little things you can do, in my opinion, that really create a big opportunity for us in the future. When we come down for the next one, hey, we can point to what we did, and then expanding those opportunities later.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And then there are the social costs that are associated here. Wendell, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I'll just start with this fact from the Coalition for the Homeless in their annual report in New York City. In 2021, 52% of those returning home from prison ended up in the New York City shelter system. In the past 4 years, over 40% of those returning home from state prison ended up in what is already an overburdened shelter system, which has led to the emergency hotels being leased by the city of New York. There was an effort to decarcerate a little bit during the course of the pandemic and the issues associated with that. This is providing this kind of supportive housing for this constituency is an enormous social cost if we do not do it. Just because of the raw numbers and the fact that thousands are coming home each year. As I said before, stabilizing one's life after being incarcerated is the #1 issue. And the #1 issue to stabilize your life upon being released from prison is to find a place to stay. And while the shelter can provide a bed for you, it is not providing the enriching environment that's going to get you to reintegrate adequately in a sustained fashion back into society. So having these kind of projects that can house these individuals with the support that they need is critical, because if not, the alternative is a social cost. The alternative is the higher probability of recidivism. I've said before the issues of public safety, and that's why we think housing is a public safety issue. And it goes to the homelessness issue too, that we're all seeing in the newspapers every day. Throw on the issue of the migrants coming up here, of course, up to New York City, and adding a further burden to the shelter system. It affects so many different issues too that get wrapped up in this fear mongering associated with the previously incarcerated in the election year, of course. And the discussions around bail and who's doing what, and these notorious issues that find themselves on the cover of the New York Post. Cost is enormous if we do not kind of address this issue, and not just providing and creating new housing opportunities. It's also looking at the way this community is discriminated against in employment, and most certainly in housing. There's a bill in City Council right now called the Fair Transfer Housing Bill that makes it unlawful for landlords and their agents to conduct criminal background checks. 90% of landlords, according to some statistics that we've been able to find part of the campaign, conduct criminal background checks. It was a very contentious City Council hearing a couple of weeks ago.
I was there.
You mentioned Chinatown, Katie, and that community has been put upon, no question about it, with the closing of Rikers and the new jail-based program, and on White Street there to replace the Tombs. Enormous opposition to it, to the point where the mayor is even reconsidering the whole borough-based jail plan. But all these issues are kind of combined, and the fear mongering associated with it, and the goal of creating and giving an opportunity for someone to stabilize their life with the first step of finding a place to stay, I think is critical and has enormous social cost if you do not do that.
Yeah,
Just add something to that on the social cost.
absolutely.
I find it really funny that in today's New York, right, there are so many complaints about crime and substance use, and you name it, but then the solution is to do nothing or make other people take unfair burden in terms of resolving what the cost is. So what the problem is. So you're seeing situations like, everybody's solution is put it in somebody else's neighborhood. But meanwhile, a lot of these families are impacted by this. Folks have sons and daughters coming out of criminal justice system. They have, I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody that's not touched by the opioid crisis that's been going on.
Yeah.
Then when you try to come up with treatment strategies that affect you personally, and if you can find a way to make those discussions personal for folks, that's the most effective form of engagement. When you have somebody who, sees the benefit through a prism of their own lived experience. And it's not an easy thing to do in a group setting, and it's not an easy thing to have folks speak up to something that might be, frankly embarrassing to them to bring up in a public setting.
Right, or weaponized against them in some other way.
Exactly. But, it is a little frustrating, but it also is a little funny that, we try to come up with these solutions and we put money and investment in to try to create solutions to these problems. And then to get this kind of backlash to address the very thing they're complaining about.
Exactly right. We're a complicated country, we're a complicated city. And there's enormous social issues and a vast array of things. And in the effort that's being put towards trying to address it, breeds the not in my backyard kind of situation, and this kind of vicious circle that's not helping the people that we're talking about need the help. Exactly, Jesse.
Yeah. Something else that comes to mind during this conversation for me as well is the fact that when people are thinking of like not in my backyard with relation to who they like do or don't want in their community, often the folks that are in your community are not going anywhere, so by not giving them housing, we're just perpetuating the risk of crime or people committing crimes of poverty. So just we can have folks in the community unhoused and unsafe and not supporting them so that they can, move on with their lives, or have folks in the communities and offer them housing and an opportunity to really stabilize and move forward. So it's not like if we don't have these developments, like the problem goes away for that community, right? Like it's not like they're going to be untouched by it. Okay. So we know that these conversations and developments often, will require some give and take on both sides. So wondering if maybe Jesse can start us off talking about a time when you had to make concessions in order to get a development pushed through without jeopardizing the needs of the folks that you were aiming to serve through that development.
Sure. And I'll go back to some of the strategies I mentioned at the outset. We've had developments get approved that, we may have proposed. One example I can think of, it was a 75 unit development. We took it down to 66. Looking at the push and pull in your financial model, looking at what we can absorb, even if it's a hit, not just for financial feasibility, you have to ask for more resources from the state to make the deal work, or the city to make the deal work. You're still able to, propel your mission. And so it could be a step, a half step in terms of what we're trying to do, but you're always looking ahead to the next thing you're trying to do. Another thing we've done often is try to incorporate different resources for infrastructure investment. One of the things that we can bring to the table is that if we have preconditions for constructing our project, we do have access as a nonprofit to a pretty big pool of resources through the housing agencies and through other resources. Brownfield cleanup program is a great example we've used to create leverage for cleaning up an environmental hazard, things like that. So those are places where we might be increasing costs, we might be reducing the amount of, something else we wanted to develop, but in the process, we can really extend, goodwill to the neighborhood and kind of continue our developments. I think for this example that I mentioned at Ocean Crest, again, it started at 120 units, it came down to 105. But in the process of it coming down to 105, we responded to a neighborhood request, which was, we don't want housing only buildings. We want something else to be located. So we've been really successful with locating daycare centers in residential buildings.
Yeah.
It's an additional expense. Generally, you have to turnkey these spaces for nonprofits that can operate the daycares. But what we've done is try to create a community benefit. And then that also creates economic empowerment for the folks in the building, right? So nothing says I can go and get a job and increase my resources and do whatever it is, then drop my child off at school downstairs, go to work, come back, pick them up, bring them up. So, that's
Mhm.
really been a model we've been very successful with. And while it isn't quite as economically simple to execute, the benefits, really dovetail with what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Thanks, Jesse. Katie, I think you have some experience here as well.
Yeah, I would just say, it's not necessarily concessions, but one thing that then Jesse was even talking about, mindful design. I mean, I will just say, because I think it's funny, because it is really a not in my backyard kind of situation, is that I'm working on a shelter right now that will directly abut a row of single family homes in a nice residential area in Queens. And when we were looking at the siting of the outdoor recreation space, the best place to put it, ideal place, was directly up against the fence for a single family home's backyard. And we all looked at that and, laughed, because no, we're not going to put it there. We're going to put it in the much less convenient spot, because honestly, even though I'm a person who'd be happy to have a homeless shelter in my community, if I owned that single family home and my kids were playing in the backyard and the recreation area was on the other side of the fence, I probably wouldn't be too happy either, right? And that's not just about the fact that it's a homeless shelter. Anything right there, I would probably not, be so happy about. And so that's just, mindful design is important too. Don't do things that are going to piss people off, unless you really have to. But some other things that are kind of like easier to throw in are, sometimes in a supportive housing project, supportive housing residents and seniors tend to be a mix that can work well depending on the supportive housing population. And so, making that, if you have a 60-40, 60% supportive, 40% affordable, if that 40% can be seniors, or some portion of it can be seniors, that can make the development a little more palatable, because for reasons I will never understand, once a person turns 55, they are much less scary to a community than someone who's 54. Also, I've seen projects where where communities have not wanted to see all studios in ones. They wanted to have, families integrated into the development. And so, I've seen projects where we've incorporated supportive housing units for families, which are definitely needed, but which can be, more difficult to lease. The supportive services that are offered are more complex in a different way. And I've seen, providers shift in that way to help make the development a little more palatable to communities that might be afraid of, say 100 single individuals moving in on the block.
Okay, thanks. Wendell, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to piggyback on what
Yeah.
my colleagues are saying. Housing the previously incarcerated is primarily single individuals, and that's what this community mostly, not entirely, obviously, but mostly is. And we have a project in our pipeline right now where we're doing the community engagement actively in Brooklyn, in the Vital Brooklyn project with the state. And there was a cry for larger apartments, Katie, even in our section of the project. And I think we're just kind of still in that discussion stage, educating kind of stage. So I'm not exactly sure how that's going to turn out exactly, because we're just trying to accommodate the population that exists. If we're going to be, and this project is going to be housing these individuals, that's just who they are. Again, we're not a major developer, so concessions are not something we are actively involved in outside of this buy-in from the community. But in our Fulton reentry community center in the Bronx, we had to make some concessions to the city of New York, who were, as I said before, supplying most of the operating funding over a long period of time. And this was right in the middle of the shelter crisis, which is still happening, but it was even worse a couple of years back. And they wanted to just be able to have unfettered access to, provide and give us, the people who are going to be staying in the reentry facility. And we had to push back a little bit because we have a certain model that we have targeting, in this particular instance, older individuals, and it's men, men, which is more palatable to the community. Actually, ironically, the city was looking for unfettered access, and the community was like, okay, if they're older, they're less likely to be an issue in the community. And I think that the city ultimately understood our philosophy on this, and we really couldn't budge on that. But we came to a compromise where they will provide us with referrals, and we'll just do our vetting and to make sure that they fit into the model that we're looking for in terms of older, and have the shown ability to transform their lives, because it's transitional. It's not permanent housing. Be able to find a place for them in 6 to 9 months, because that's the model. Has the whole basis of transitional to get more people to turn over a certain amount of time, so you can accommodate as many people as possible. Those are the two examples I could think of in terms of sessions, just negotiations and ongoing negotiations to fit within the model that we're trying to achieve with these projects.
Yeah, thank you. So before we head into kind of like a Q&A and I pass things off to Emma, wondering what final advice would you give to groups that are looking to develop projects to serve folks that have experienced being incarcerated in the past? Anyone can take it. Anyone can kick us off.
I'll take it. I think, this is something in the pre-meet we discussed a little bit. Be open and direct with what you're doing, and be clear about the services you're providing with the community, so that folks don't feel like it's a bait and switch. If you present an affordable housing development, it turns out later they find out about a set-aside, you're going to be creating a lot more problems for yourself, not only with your elected officials, but you're starting from a basis of mistrust. So, I would say being open, being direct, and looking for ways where you can meet a community need, whether that's slicing and dicing that prospect to create certain targeted benefits for the community, creating housing for, the formerly incarcerated that are coming into a community as a preference group, ways that you can work within your marketing plan to, really address some of those concerns that are brought up, I think is critical. The second one would be making sure that you're partnered with an effective social services organization to provide the wraparound supports that folks need to be successful in those developments. You're coming in and you're proposing new housing. Everybody says we love to see new housing, or we want to see a new building, and that's good. And we're happy to see a new building, but who are you putting in there? Always comes up as the question. That's the NIMBY, failed NIMBY thing. Making sure that they know that there's a responsible steward that's providing those kind of services in a way that's supportive and really addresses some of those personalizes those issues for the folks in the building. Super important, but probably the most important thing we do. So there's just a couple of examples for me.
Yeah, those are great. Thank you. Katie, Wendell?
I could jump in quickly. Just like you said, if you don't do it yourself, bring in an experienced service provider who has extensive experience working with this community, because it is a lot of challenges associated with that. And the more experience dealing with recurring themes, they're kind of the same issues, generally speaking, with this community, and trying to get them to transform their lives, because from getting identification to getting their benefits to enlisting in healthcare programs, extensive counseling. If there's other family members involved, there's all the whole gamut of support that are necessary to do. And if you don't have that, you usually have to bring somebody in who has that. This is the credible messenger thing that I was talking about. And you have to have a level of patience, certainly, and know that they're going to be challenges on an ongoing basis. As I said before, earlier in the discussion, you have to have a commitment to this community, commitment to the community which the project is in, that has to continue beyond the planning stage. It goes through construction, completion, and lease up, and all that stuff. Just to be truthful, debate and switch is the worst thing that could possibly happen. We breed all kind of problems with that, and then the elected stuff to come down on you, and that's not going to help anybody. So stay sincere, stay committed to the community, stay committed to the constituency you're trying to help, and work with experienced operators.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. Thank you. I think too, just thinking about the transition from street homelessness shelter, even going straight from incarceration into housing, is a pretty huge transition. And there's a lot that goes into making sure that folks are supported once they get into housing, and continuing to
smartphones, transportation.
Yeah.
It's a whole new world for a lot of these individuals, and a lot of, I use the word patience, but a lot of hand-holding, banking, it's quite a bit.
Yeah, so having strong community partners and service partners is really critical.
Sure.
Katie, you want to finish us off with some final words of wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, my last thought would be, once the project is open, don't forget to stay in touch with everyone that you were in touch with during the planning process. And one of the things that New York City has done for shelters that I think is really effective is the community advisory board model. And I have seen successful housing developers implement something similar, to enable community members to have an open forum to, touch base about the development and its impacts. And, sort of creating a system for that ongoing feedback in the community is really important.
Yeah. Great. Thank you all so much. This is a really robust discussion. There is so much that goes into housing development, even when there's not a ton of opposition that you're facing. And when you're doing hard work like this, it's the payoff is worth it, but it's a long road and there's a lot to consider. So thank you so much for your expertise and sharing your experiences. And I'm going to turn it over to Emma now to lead us through a question and answer session and close us out.
Thanks, Lauren.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and panelists. That was great. What a great conversation. Oops, sorry, my cat. Okay. Anyways, we wanted to open the floor for some question and answers, Q&A session. Hope that you all came with some great questions or feedback, comments to propose to our panelists here that we still have for 15 more minutes. So feel free to come off mute, put in the chat any thoughts that you might have. I know I have one if I can break the ice and kick us off. So I was wondering, I think it was mentioned in one of the responses about maybe glazed over about partnerships. I wondered if you all could speak more to what project partnerships matter when starting a new project, what's kind of essential to look for in partnerships. and was wondering more about that.
I can take that unless somebody
Go
else.
ahead, go ahead.
Sure. So ideal partnerships for us tend to be with neighborhood-based groups that can speak to the community in an organizing capacity. Maybe they're the local development corporation, maybe they're a local nonprofit that's been in the community for 40, 50 years. We've had really great success with, it's a slightly different dynamic, but with a deal we're working on in East Harlem, with a local partner there that's been a developer and a community kind of engagement piece. And they've really helped introduce us to the community, not just to the elected officials, but also to local stakeholders. And then in a social services capacity, I think you can go to the big players that are borough-wide, or you can go to the folks that may, be specifically targeted in a neighborhood that you're working in, that know those dynamics kind of block to block. And so there's a lot of different ways to form these relationships and these partnerships. I don't think that there's one firm way to do it. I think it's just making sure that they're credible and that they have connections that they can leverage, which have some evidence attached to them. So making sure that we've had experiences in new developments, new neighborhoods we've gone into where after your first planning board meeting, you get bombarded with people that say, I know these people, whatever it is, but the organization doesn't really have that capacity. There tends to be I would use solid vetting when you're figuring out who the right people are to target.
For us, it's a little flip. We're mostly the service provider, although we're dipping on the development side. Hopefully we could do more. But for the projects that we're currently working on in our immediate pipeline, we look for an affordable housing developer that is committed to our issues. Is the sincerity issue again, but also can get the job done too. And they have a track record of social consciousness, certainly, but also an ability to build up a project. And if there's public review required, or ULURPs, or whatever kind of issues along financing and putting the necessary pieces together to make a project be built, along with that social commitment, along with our commitment to our community, those are double wins for us.
That's great. Thank you. That's really helpful. We are getting a couple questions in the chat. One is, this has been a great and helpful conversation. Would you all suggest different approaches for as of right projects that don't technically require community approval?
I'll respond to that one. That's a really good question. The top line answer is no, but also kind of yes. Meaning that I think you still need to do outreach work in the community. However, I think that like the project that I mentioned earlier, at a certain point, you're going to have to rely on your funding partners to help you push a project through, regardless of what the response is. But one thing that you have to remember is that even if it's as of right, once your project is done, you're going to have to. You're going to literally be living in that community for however long your regulatory agreement is and beyond. And so if you are seen as an outsider who comes in, does a project and doesn't listen to what anyone wants, you're not going to be setting yourself up for success. So I would say I would do the exact same thing if a project is as of right, but I would feel a little bit more empowered while doing it.
Great,
Thank-
thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, I do have one question, Katie. When you were talking about the projects in Chinatown, you mentioned that one helping factor was having HPD not give in for the success of that one project, like moving forward. What role do housing agencies, or in this case, HPD, really play in making sure a project is successful in New York City?
Well, in that case, it was DHS. And in DHS's case, in the case of DHS, those projects don't require council approval as long as they're zoned properly. So, it is what it is. They have a lot of sway. I think the agencies do have a lot of leeway. But again, they all want to see some kind of community engagement and community investment because, and this is important, it's important to put affordable housing, supportive housing, and shelter projects in all kinds of communities, in high-income communities, low-income communities, Black and brown communities, white, it doesn't matter. It's important that those projects are in all types of communities. However, sometimes the cost of trying to put the project in a community where it's just not going to fit might be too high. And when we have such scarce resources in terms of the financing sources, in terms of time, in terms of labor, the actual employees to process projects at the city agencies are in such scarce supply, to a certain degree, I can't speak for the city and how they make decisions, but I would imagine that knowing that there's a path to success is pretty important.
Another comment in the chat, which I know CSH has seen and heard from our stakeholders nationwide, is from Crystal, who says, I think the biggest challenge is when there's community or neighborhood discontent with a development and the municipality limits where these types of supportive and affordable housing developments can go. These two compounded can be a real challenge to getting needed housing built when you are working with particular populations who are already disenfranchised in the community. And I totally agree with that. I don't know if you all have more to say or speak to with that, but so true.
I can think of nothing more challenging than restrictive zoning and exclusionary zoning. And it's something that, I was encouraged to hear what the governor was proposing with some of these restrictions, especially in places like Long Island, where new zoning density may be allowed around transit centers. I think that's important. I think it needs to go further, where if we are increasing density around transit centers, creating affordability preferences and requirements. If the state's going to be making these kind of changes, I think it's super important that at least a portion of those units are going to serve an underserved population. It's been a huge challenge, and I think none of us like going through ULURP. And if there's a way that ULURP can be reformed, it seems like it comes up every year and it never goes anywhere. To limit some of the ability of local legislative officials to really control what happens within their districts. That would be also a huge step forward. And I think recently there was some movement on a deal in Whitestone that actually got overridden by the city council from the council members' veto. So the hope is these things are really moving in the direction where the industry can be a little freed up to overcome some of these barriers.
Awesome, thank you. Another question in the chat. Thanks for the informative session. And I know you all did lose over this, but I'm curious if you've asked to give evidence to prove that bringing in homeless people wouldn't make the community less safe. I know you all touched on this, but maybe you could give some specific examples of what evidence you brought forward to the community to combat this stereotype misinformation.
I haven't. It's kind of hard to find statistics that have a direct causation between bringing in previously homeless people and increasing crime. I'm not aware of statistics that show that direct correlation. I know that when we apply for Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative funding, they do ask just for the some statistics on crime in a particular area. But again, I'm not aware of from a community point of view being asked to show statistically that there's no correlation between bringing in a homeless population and increasing crime in that community.
It's such a complicated question because it's so integrated between policing measures, between supportive services in a community, between what the community looked like and before and after the shelter, the population density, right? I mean, a 50-bed shelter in one community might look very different than a 50-bed shelter in a in a rural community, for example, and how that data is really making an impact. So I haven't come up in this particular data point in certain discussions, and I think New York City makes it kind of easy because so many of their programs require a homeless set aside. So you're not really asked to prove or disprove that piece. But I think when it's a homeless shelter question, I haven't seen that.
Is there a way to maybe like pivot the question and say, well, if there are these new community supports, then that actually makes the community safe, and showing kind of like how the development will make the community safer? Maybe you can't show stats on crime, but is there evidence you show of how this is like community building, I guess, with development projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it can be, there are some to answer that specific point, I mean, there are some softer things, you can explain how many cameras your project is going to have, and you can explain that, you're going to have maybe a roving security guard, for example, or in many supportive housing projects, there's someone at the front desk, 24 hours a day, which isn't necessarily a security person, but what that does mean is that 24 hours a day, there's someone paying attention on the block, which can, might be, a comfort to folks. I would also say though, and this is not exactly the right discussion for this maybe, but I think it's a really important point. Jesse alluded to the homeless set-asides that the city requires in almost every project. One thing that I have found, and a lot of folks have found, is that those homeless set-asides don't come with any service dollars, because the city believes that, and I'm sure this population exists, I think it's just probably smaller than the city thinks, that the folks that they're referring are homeless individuals who do not require social supportive services of any kind. And without fail, the projects that I have worked on that have had those homeless set-asides that do not have any kind of service dollars attached to them, it's been very, very challenging for those formerly homeless individuals to integrate into the community on a micro level in the building, and on the block in the larger community. And so I think that that kind of evidence, which is very real, and which we have evidence of in the number of police calls and things like that to a certain block, that evidence kind of works against us when we're trying to talk about how bringing homeless folks to a block is not going to be detrimental, and then it makes the job a lot harder having to explain, like, this is supportive housing, which is different from housing for homeless people where no supportive services are provided, right? And that's one of my pet peeves about city policy, but I think it's really important.
Breach. I have the same issue. Taking homeless individuals and then don't provide the services is my biggest qualm with the program.
Well, go ahead, Lauren.
Oh no, we're at time. I'm not gonna.
Yeah, we're at time. Just wanted to uplift Lauren's comment here too, which is super important, that there's no evidence that shows that formerly incarcerated people are any less likely to be good tenants and neighbors. And that is something that you could refute with too. Well, thanks so much again to our panelists and to our moderator and presenter, Lauren, Jesse, Wendell, Katie. You all were great and fantastic. And we really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to embark this great knowledge and experience with us. And I really hope our attendees can take this great info and use it in our communities to make more supportive and affordable housing developments. And I have a big virtual round of applause on my Zoom square if you can see it. And in the chat, Camilla has put in some info on our next session in February, and then about our little survey, if you don't mind filling that out, attendees. And with that, I will give you all freedom on your Tuesday. I hope you have a great day, and thank you so much again, panelists.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.